Hello, good day. I'm so glad that you're here, whatever time of the day or night it is for you. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad you're here. And if you're actually with us live, I know you could be watching this later, but if you're with us live, I'd like you to go into the comments section of whatever social media platform you're on and say hello. Tell us where you're located. I'd love to know that. That will make for a more interesting and useful conversation. So while you're here, I want you to just imagine that you're joining my guest and I for a cup of coffee or a water or whatever you drink at this time of the day. And if you were at the table with us as we chatted, you would share your comments and your questions and your ideas. And so I want you to do the same thing in the comment section. So just do that. I can see them. I may pull one up and we may use it. If you do those things, if you make yourself at home, pull up a chair and engage in the conversation, we'll have a better conversation. You'll learn more and eventually we'll have a better podcast. Yes, podcast. If you didn't know, or if you didn't notice that little box up in the top corner that says Remarkable Leadership Podcast, eventually this will be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, but it won't include all the stuff we just said because that was all just for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a countdown where we will clip the audio and video to start the podcast. So that will begin in 3, 2, 1. Can we have a culture that supports great profitability and reaches environmental and sustainability goals too? Can we have a culture that will allow us to thrive in any crisis? Our guest today knows that we can do those things. In fact, that is our focus today. We're going to talk about consciously creating and growing a culture that can do all of those things and more. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been here live. Well, you can't go backwards and be live for this one, but you could join us for future live episodes. And to learn about when those take place and how to get connected to those, just join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. And now I want to bring in our guest. I'll bring her in and introduce her right now. Her name is Shaara Roman. She is a best-selling author of the new book, The Conscious Workplace, and is the founder CEO of the Silverine Group, a culture consulting firm ranked 71st on Inc. magazine's list of mid-Atlantic region's fastest growing private companies. An award-winning entrepreneur with global experience, she and her team help organizations optimize performance by creating inclusive workplace cultures and aligning company values with business goals. She's been featured in numerous publications and is a frequent guest on popular and top HR podcasts, and today, our podcast. She was born in India, schooled in Nigeria and England, and lived in Greece before coming to the U.S., where she is today. She holds an MBA from Georgetown, where she also teaches as an adjunct professor and serves on several advisory and not-for-profit boards. And unlike many of my other guests, we've actually met before. Shaara, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Kevin, thank you for having me. Yes, and I'm so excited that we actually have this chance to have this conversation after meeting so many years ago.
So it was a long time ago, and like I said, so often when I'm meeting with someone here, this is the first time I've met them, but that's not the case today. So I just told everybody a little bit about you, but what led you to doing this kind of work? Why culture work? What led you to all of this?
Well, so hello, everyone. Excited to be here and have this conversation with all of you. I guess the culture work started from a couple of different places. One is prior to launching my business in 2016, I had actually worked in some really great organizations in the DC area, public companies, private companies, trade association. And I got pulled into probably over the last sort of 20 years of my career, culture work, whether it was spinning off a piece of the business, whether it was sort of reimagining what the workplace could look like and sort of getting out of restatement and all of that work at Fannie Mae, or getting out of the getting through the restatement at Fannie Mae, whether it was a lot of M&A work when I was at CGI. Culture was always sort of a piece of what we did and what I was drawn to. And as someone who lived all over the world, as you sort of mentioned in when you introduced me, figuring out as a young child, as an adolescent, how do I really sort of fit in to wherever it is I am? And how do I also stay true to who I am? Because those were sort of the family values that were impressed upon me, was always something that was top of mind, right? And while I didn't know that it was culture at the time, and I didn't know all of these work words, it was really about finding a home, finding a place where I could belong, figuring out sort of how do I sort of find a space for myself, and how do I really connect with the people around me. And as I moved into the corporate world and moved up and moved around in different places, that's what kept coming up, right? Is how do you really foster environments where people really feel like they are connected, where they can bring their full selves into the workplace, where they can leverage their talents and their abilities. So long answer to that very simple question of what led me to this work.
So I opened this episode by saying we're going to talk about culture. You just mentioned culture. The word culture is in the subtitle of the book, but it's not in the title. The title of the book says The Conscious Workplace. So my question begs this question, like, what is a conscious workplace? Let's start right there.
Well, Kevin, why don't you just have everyone read the book?
Well, I'll hold it up.
I'm teasing.
We are talking about
I'm kidding.
Workplace by Shaara. Let's be honest, everybody.
Yeah.
We want you to love Shaara and love this content enough that you will go out and get a copy of the book. But tell us is that when you say a conscious workplace, what do you mean?
I will. Yes, I was just kidding with you. So a conscious workplace is really about being intentional. It's about a group of leaders sort of coming together and being very thoughtful about engaging with their employees, bottoms up, top down, sort of sideways, to say, what is the kind of culture that we want in this organization, and what is that culture that is going to take us forward? So it's being intentional. It's being connecting your culture back to the purpose, back to the why of why the company exists. And, obviously, if a company is in its very early stages and is founder led, that culture is most likely going to be in the head of the founder, right? Or the co-founders. And then as the company grows, it's good to start to get sort of some of that infusion of other people's ideas of what are they experiencing, how are they experiencing it, how do they want this to go. So when you are conscious about your culture, you're really thinking about your values, and not values that you just plaster up on your website or your wall, right? Back in the day when we were all in offices, I go in and I see these values plastered everywhere. And 80% of the time, they weren't being lived fully, right? And they were also
halfly.
Yeah, very good point. And most of the time, the values were these words that just have been pulled out of the sky that, seemed good. If you walked into a government contractor, everyone has, we have values of ethics and honesty and integrity. Well, yeah, of course, like that should just be the foundation of your business. But what really differentiates you, right? And what are those behaviors that you expect people to demonstrate? How are you going to drive accountability when that rainmaker doesn't drive those values? And you appreciate all the revenue they're bringing in, but what does that really mean in a conscious way, in an intentional way, right? So I use the metaphor of the iceberg in the book, right, a lot. And it's kind of visually, right? It's about what do you tell people on the outside and, above the waterline, what is that tip of the iceberg that people see or they read? And then below the waterline, what are they really experiencing? And so that all kind of pulls it together in terms of what is a conscious workplace.
So tell me a little bit more. I mean, it is one of the things that I flagged as I was reading the book was this idea of what we say and what it's really like. Can you give me an example, maybe at an unnamed client, perhaps, or just in some time in your life, about how it shows up? It seems like it's just not quite connecting.
It's not connecting for you. So let's just say that at your company, you say that you value diversity, or that you really support professional development, or that you are innovative, or that you're fun, right? These are all things that we've heard people describe their companies to be. But on, let's say, the
And
diversity
there's
side,
nothing wrong with any of them.
and there's nothing wrong.
Clear,
Those are all
right?
good things. And actually, that's what we want, right? We want diverse and inclusive and fun and all of those things. But let's just say you're diverse and inclusive, and then you walk, whether it's virtually or physically, into the organization, and you don't actually see true diversity, right? What you might see is tokenism, or you pull up a leadership team on the website and you see homogeneous leaders, um, or you sort of take that to the next step around inclusion, and you see that, yeah, there might be a couple of folks that sort of don't look like the others or act like the others or are educated like the others, right? Because diversity is not just about race and gender. um, but you see that those ideas are not allowed to sort of really come to the surface, right? People are marginalized, or their ideas are dismissed, or people talk over them. Those are the types of things of, hey, we're saying diversity and inclusion here, but it doesn't show up here. We're talking about fun. Well, what does fun mean? Because fun for you, Kevin, might be very different fun for me, right? If I'm a young mom and I've got, 2 kids at home and I've got to pick my third kid up from daycare, fun, or I'm a dad and that's my responsibility, I may not want to have uh, beers after work, every day, because that isn't fun anymore, right?
Or
It
I
might have
might
been,
want to,
or
but
it
there's no chance I can do it, right? So,
might,
like, are you serious? I'd
yeah,
love that, but right, that's not going to work for me, right?
yeah,
So, yeah, absolutely. So,
yeah,
there's that the idea of the cultural iceberg is the disconnect between what we say and what we see, feel, hear when we're in the organization, right?
yeah.
So, why does all of this culture stuff, Shaara? Why does it even matter? Now, I mean, I've asked people this before, and here's the thing. More people are talking about culture more of the time now than I can ever remember, and yet I think this is a question worth asking. Why does it matter? Why are we all talking about it so much?
Well, culture is always the differentiator. And I know people talk about products and services. They talk about, sort of, well, the technology that they might have, but ultimately the culture is your foundation. It's your glue. It's sort of what brings your strategy to life. And we all have heard the old Peter Drucker quote of culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch or dinner. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I've seen organizations, whether I've been inside or worked with them, where you might have a fantastic strategy, you might even have sort of great leadership in place, but if you don't have a strong culture where everybody understands the mission and the purpose and the way things are done around here are sort of in a cohesive way, which is sort of how I define culture, right? You're going to have mismatches, and you're going to have people sort of go off the reservation a little bit or a lot, and you won't necessarily have your business strategy brought to life. Secondly, I think we do talk a lot about culture, but I think we do a lot of talking and not so much executing, and not so much sort of really taking it very seriously, because I think everybody thinks they know culture. Everyone thinks they can sort of do culture. And a lot of people say these words around culture, or they'll come to me and they'll say, well, we have a really great culture. We just built a game room. I mean, this is back prior to COVID, right? And we have all these ping pong tables, or we have a great culture. We send everyone an Uber Eats, $20 certificate for lunch every Friday. And those are things, but that's not culture, right? That's not really this sort of connection of how we all feel about the organization, how we all show up, how we live the values, etc. And it's more and more important in my mind, because it is that differentiator. And when we talk about, the triple bottom line, which is sort of phrase that was coined, or a movement that was coined back in the 1990s, to now ESG. That is what is going to really not only differentiate you, but allow that ESG movement to actually take hold. And now for board members to be able for board of directors to hold their CEOs and organizations accountable.
You said something at the start of that set of statements that I think is really interesting. You said you might even have good leaders, but still have trouble with culture. And I think a lot of people would say, well, good leaders would be working on building good culture. So like, talk about that for a second. The situation where we have, quote, good leaders, but we don't necessarily have great culture. Talk about that.
Yeah. I think there's sort of a couple of different ways to sort of explore that. One is the good leaders can be good leaders from their functional perspective, and good leaders in terms of what they are sort of doing for the business, but they may not fully understand or lean into the role of leadership as a role model, as a culture champion, of fully leaning in with empathy, fully leaning in with curiosity. So I don't want to call them bad leaders, because they're not necessarily awful, right? But they're not fully embracing that role of how do you really be fully inclusive? How do you really sort of embody that culture consciously in your organization and sort of take it through? And leaders, oftentimes, and I know you've talked about this, is we tend to promote people who are really good functionally at what they do. And we have been doing that now for decades, Kevin, right? I have been talking about it, experiencing it, wanting to make some changes in organizations, but we are so wired with the way you move up in an organization, or the way you're recognized as an authority, is to have the big fancy title of vice president or senior vice president, or, name your fancy title, right? And that makes you sort of a leader. Well, that doesn't necessarily make you a leader of people. And I think that's the piece that we need to sort of really fully infuse into the leaders that are in organizations.
I love that. Thank you. One of the things, and this is not meant to be a book report nor a test. I mean, I've been on your side of the microphone lots of times, right? So, if you draw a blank here, I'm happy to help. But you talk at one point about that we could, my words now, that you could sort of lump cultures into one of four buckets. You call them four types of cultures. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Because I think this is a really useful thing. It doesn't mean there are only four cultures. It just means that we can start to, I think it might be useful for people to start to see, oh yeah, well we're kind of more like that.
Yeah.
So yeah. Would you share those?
I'd be happy to. Yeah. So the four cultures that I sort of describe in the book, one is the kind of the good old boy culture, which tends to be a more traditional culture, or traditional, I'd say, hierarchical. It tends to be much more paternalistic. It's often the kinds of cultures that you experience, certainly in the DC area, in associations that have been led by the same CEO that may be in their 60s or 70s now. And I don't mean that 60 and 70-year-old people are sort of, bad or or any of that. It's just that their mindset, right? If they aren't leaning into a growth mindset and changing and adapting and recognizing that things are very different from when they entered leadership in the 70s, that's where you sort of run into issues. So it's this culture where, again, being paternalistic in one respect wasn't a bad thing, right? Because it was about taking care of the people in your organization. But when it gets into where it's sort of more misogynistic, where it's, hey, we at the top know best and don't want to hear from the rest of you. Keep your head down, do your job, don't ask questions, don't challenge the status quo. Those are all the types of ways that culture comes to life, right? And that is not a place where people can really thrive. And that is the kind of culture where if you are different, whether it's your education, whether it's your gender, whether it's how you navigated the work world, whatever those differences might be, that you're not often embraced in the same way as someone who maybe didn't. And sort of followed the path of the leader and the leadership teams. And oftentimes those organizations tend to have very homogeneous leadership teams, which we all know, right? The statistics show that the more diversity you have on your team, the more sort of differences of ethnicity and race and gender and education and geography and socioeconomic status and all those, hundreds of different demographics, that contributes to a better organization. So those are the types of kind of those good old boy types of or kind of hierarchical paternalistic organizations. The other one is the get on board culture. And probably the best way to describe the get on board culture is sort of a scene from the show The Office, right? Where it's maybe portrayed by my son will sort of he always gets mad when I say this, right? Because he loves The Office, but it's sort of contextualized or comes to life through a lot of horsing around, where the fun is only fun for a certain group of people, right? Where it's a lot of slapstick comedy and maybe off-color jokes, and again, it sort of may have been acceptable at one time in the work world, but really doesn't provide a place where everybody feels comfortable, right? If people are joking about people being gay or joking about people's body types or whatever might be happening. Not to say that we want to have these straight-laced, uptight organizations, not saying that at all, but there has to be sort of a context of professionalism and balance and inclusion when you're trying to have when you're trying to build an inclusive organization. The other culture, which we see a lot, is what I sort of term the nice culture, NICE, nice. And it's an organization or a type of culture where everybody's very polite to each other. Everyone's very kind. Again, all good things, right? But what's happening in that culture is that honest, radical, candid conversations are not happening. Decisions are made in a conference room or in a meeting, and everybody nods yes. And then, everybody moves on to the next meeting. And then you find out, the next day or 2 hours later, that all the decisions that were made and everything that everyone agreed to has been undone, because actually the debate happened with the two people that held the most power and sort of changed the outcome. Right. And again, in those organizations,
or maybe had already decided it before the meeting started,
or had already been decided before. Yes. So those are sort of the three that are not great. And oftentimes people sort of sit in all three, right? There's little bits of that culture. And going back to sort of one of the first questions you asked me about, sort of what's the conscious workplace, the other element, right, is that you want your culture to be consistent across the organization. You shouldn't have completely different experiences depending on which manager you work for. There really has to be sort of this, common theme that runs throughout the organization. Although you want to recognize that everyone who works for you is an individual, right? But the culture that we all want to move towards is really a culture of belonging, right? Where you are recognizing, where you're leaning into sort of the human-centeredness of your organization, where you are being really conscious and intentional about the culture you're creating, that you're putting leaders in place that actually want to take care and nurture the talent that they have on their teams. So when you have that belonging culture, people who everyone can really thrive in that place, right? Yeah, sorry, I saw that.
I put a comment up there, and I didn't mean to sort of interrupt your train of thought. So let me just comment. Todd says a culture by definition is inclusive. Is it not? Certainly some will not like the culture, and said that's okay. So do you want to comment to Todd's point?
So yeah, I don't know that culture by definition is inclusive. I think culture by definition is the way we do things around here, right? And of course, there are a lot of different definitions, but that's sort of the way that I like to sort of simplify it. It's about the norms, the rituals, the behaviors, the reinforcing mechanisms, the mindsets, all of those things that make up that organization. And yes, some people may not like a particular way a culture comes to life in an organization. However, if an organization, and that's okay, and they can sort of move on, right? But at the end of the day, I think it depends, why are they leaving? Are they leaving because they are being marginalized? Are they leaving because their ideas can't come to bear and they can't take risks and learn? Are they leaving or uncomfortable in that culture because they're sort of shut down or made fun of or whatever, right? And those are all the indications or symptoms of a culture that doesn't foster that sense of belonging. So I think if you have a sense of belonging, you're going to be attracting people into your organization that really want to be a part of that organization and that want to contribute and can grow and can help the organization meet their business goals. But I don't know that I necessarily see that just because you have a culture, it's inclusive.
Okay. Everyone's included in it. I think that might be what Todd
Yes,
said,
correct.
but
Yes.
not inclusive in the way that you're describing it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we could unpack a lot of things, Shaara, and I knew that this would happen. I'm looking at the
Yeah.
clock, and I want to make sure that we don't take too much of anybody's time based on what we've our expectations in general. So, but I do want to ask you this: is there something that we didn't talk about? Is there any particular thing that you think we should have? Something I didn't ask that you wish I would have?
Yeah, there are probably two things I would want to sort of stress, and I touched on the first one sort of early on, right, or earlier on, which is the triple bottom line and ESG. And for those who are listening now and in the future, I would hope to convey the message that culture is not sort of this squishy, nice to have, sort of soft thing that we sort of warm and fuzzy people sort of talk about, because I don't think I'm warm and fuzzy. And as a business owner, I'm trying to grow my business. I'm trying to generate profits. I'm trying to do good in the world. All of those things. And I think if we think about culture in the context of the triple bottom line, and or sort of ESG, which is environment, sustainability, and governance, and we think about it in the context of how does culture make our business richer, and how does it actually, if we focus on people and we focus on purpose and purpose-driven culture, we can actually be more profitable, because there are many companies and stories, and we certainly don't have time to get into them, like Patagonia and Chobani and Lisa and CGI, right? I can just name so many companies that have leaned into a much broader way of thinking about their organization, and that they are doing phenomenally well and have managed to do really well, throughout the pandemic and before and after.
Andrew, hold on. I
Yeah.
want to dive into that, because Andrew, I think you've answered part of Andrew's question without knowing it. Andrew asks, he says, so what do we do? Like, what are my first steps to capture C-suite's attention to generate consistent culture when there's a strong focus with the economy on delivering high productivity? I think you've really answered this, at least in the big picture, but is there a specific step or two you would suggest to an influencer who's not in the C-suite to get the attention of folks in the C-suite, other than ordering them copies of your book, I suppose?
Thanks for that, Kevin. I would, so Andrew, I would say that, maybe talking to the C-suite a little bit about the triple bottom line and how you can actually, when you focus on purpose, you can actually drive those profits is a good thing. I think, talking about maybe bringing in a coach, for example, to work on team dynamics and team productivity, because something like that can help. So it's sort of going to sort of the head, right? I like to talk about the head, heart, and the wallet. So it's going to sort of the sort of the head part of the C-suite that's saying, oh yeah, that makes sense. We want to deliver more. We want to have more productivity. Yeah, we can make some investments, right? The financial piece in terms of how this is going to get this team to perform at a higher level, because we'll focus on maximizing sales or maximizing communication or, whatever it is, right? Customer experience, whatever that end result is that you want, but you can use that as a way to sort of really have that culture conversation and use that teamwork, that team sort of design work to say, what's getting in the way of us really delivering to our clients? Are there things that are happening? And you don't even have to say the C word, right? You can just say, what are the things that are happening that are allowing us to deliver on these goals or these objectives that we've been left with? And what is, so what's getting in the way and what's facilitating it? And often that what's getting in the way and what's facilitating, that's your culture, right? Is it that you've jumped through
People want to
17?
you can call it work process, Andrew.
Yes, right.
But it ultimately is culture, right?
Yes.
So, so Shaara, enough of this.
Okay.
I want to know a little bit more about you. So tell us all what you do for fun. We know that you love your work. It's very clear in listening to you that you do. But what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? So I love the theater. So I recently saw Into the Woods for the second time. One of my my brother and brother-in-law's really good friend was starring in the DC production or the Broadway production at the Kennedy Center of Into the Woods. Felicia Curry, just shout out to her. I love to just I have a puppy. Well, he's no longer a puppy. He's almost 3. So I love to play with my Aussie Doodle. I've got 2 kids, a daughter who's a 19-year-old sophomore in college and a 17-year-old son. So love to hang out with them. Love to hang out with my husband. Love to just do like a porch hang with friends and neighbors, you know, especially when the weather is nice. I enjoy just, you know, walking or running through the neighborhood, through some of the really beautiful trails that we have, you know, in the DC area. I do enjoy reading. I don't get to it as much as I used to. Life is just a little crazy, and I love to travel. I just have now discovered that I can have a girls' trip with my daughter, and it's so fun to have a grown kid that wants to hang. And yeah, so those are the kinds of things I like to do.
Well, you mentioned reading. You knew it was the only question I was going to ask you. Yeah. And so what are you reading, or what is something you've read recently that you might share with the rest of us?
Yeah, so actually a book I'm going to start reading, but I have a little bit of insight into, is a book called The Reluctant Presenter by a friend and colleague, Megan Dotter. Dotter, and she also recently released her book, and it's about everything that you might need to know about speaking. And so it's whether it's speaking for, you know, for us, Kevin, and others that might sort of be doing keynotes and getting on stage, speaking and sort of persuading and influencing within an organization. And so, yeah, so I'm looking forward to diving into that.
The Reluctant Presenter.
The Reluctant
There are
Presenter.
many people in this world who are reluctant presenters.
Yes, it's a great title. Great
title. The Conscious Workplace, Fortify Your Culture by to thrive in any crisis. The question is, where can they get the book? Where can they learn more? Where do you want to point people, Shaara?
Yeah, so probably the easiest place to learn more is my author website, or my book website, which is just my first and last name, so shaararoman.com. Book is available on Amazon or any retailer that you choose to buy your books. It is not on Audible. I'm so sorry, but that will potentially come one day. And if you want to learn more about the work that we do and how we help organizations, you can go to our website, thesilveringgroup.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm probably the most active there at shaararoman.com. My company is on Instagram. We're also on Twitter under my handle, Shaara Roman. So reach out, LinkedIn, connect, send an email. Happy to continue the conversation. And if you go to the Shaara Roman website, there's actually a very quick culture quiz that you can take that speaks to the 4 types of culture that we discussed, and you'll get a little report back.
SHAARA Roman, ROMAN.com. That's where you can go to get that, as well as silveringgroup.com. We're not quite done with you, Shaara, but for everybody else, I have a question I ask you every single week. And the question is now, what action will you take as a result of having been here? What is the idea that you have in your head? That's good, but what's better is what action are you going to take as a result? Shaara said something earlier. There's an awful lot of talk about culture, not near enough action about culture. Makes me think of an Elvis song, but we'll move on from there. But the point is that if you don't take action on something that you took from this, then the value of the time that you just spent with us went down drastically, because hopefully we were entertaining, but there are things that you could watch or listen to that would be more entertaining, but maybe not nearly so many things that could change the future of your business, change the future of your team, change the future for you as a leader because of what you learned here. But only, again, if you take action on it. I hope you'll do that. And so, Shaara, thanks so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thank you so much for hosting me.
It was my pleasure. And I get the great fortune, everyone, of doing this every week. So if this is the first time you've joined us, make sure you come back. Go to your favorite podcast app and find the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And while you're there, give it a like, give it some stars, or whatever that might be, whatever particular app that might be. And come back and join us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everyone.